Welcome to The Next Stage, the podcast where we turn up the house lights on the future of the venue and events management industry. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started, this is your go-to source for the trends, innovations and best practices you need to create memorable experiences.
The amount of information and the amount of change and the amount of opportunity has never been greater.
We've literally broken down walls and we're looking at how can we create a more seamless experience.
There's customer demand for sustainability now.
On the forefront when it comes to venues that might not look like what you think of as a venue today.
Welcome back to The Next Stage. I'm your host, VMA CEO Joel Edmondson, and I'm thrilled to welcome the ever-eloquent and insightful Kurt Schulte-Schrepping with me today. How are you, Kurt?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic, mate. Thanks for having me, Joel.
Kurt, usually I'll start the podcast by reading a bio that's been given to me by a marketing person in a venue. But in the spirit of the podcast today, which is going to be on how First Nations concepts of community, place and connection to country can meaningfully shape the design, operation and management of venues in the future, I really want to conduct this conversation in the context of the way a yarn would happen in community. And not to say that I'm the master of that, but I've had enough exposure to have a feel for it. And, you know, usually we'd begin a yarn by getting to know each other and introducing ourselves. But rather than me introduce you, it'd be great first just for you to talk about what's the role of an introduction in building a relationship in community.
Sure. Look, I really appreciate that we get to start it that way. I mentioned to you before, this morning I spoke to a bunch of students and we talked about this very topic. And I suppose we can start, in terms of our introduction, we can start by acknowledging country and acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're on. One of the things that I like to do is also acknowledge the responsibility that we have as shared custodians of this land. We're on the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people where we're recording this podcast. But I live in South Brisbane, you live here as well, and 500 years from now, people will look back on the time that we spent here and how we conducted ourselves when it came to country and how we treated the land and the people around us. An introduction in Indigenous culture is not like it is in traditional Western society or the way they perceive things. And the best example I have from my own experiences is when I was living and working in the Northern Territory in a previous role. Currently, I'm the Director of First Nations Strategy at the Queensland Performing Arts Centre. But what I do doesn't actually matter in terms of an introduction. It's not about who I am. It's just what I do. And I was participating in the Community Safety Night Patrol program and I was working with an auntie. It was the first night I got to work with her. And the first question she asked me was, "Who is your mother-in-law?" It wasn't, "What do you do?" She couldn't care less what I did as a job role. I have a few degrees. I've played sport at a pretty high level. All of these things I think are magnificent accomplishments. They actually have nothing to do with who I am as a person. And so I showed her who my mother-in-law is. Shout out Tracy, my partner Linda's mother. I talked about the relationship that I have and where she's from. Her family is from Wales. And the following night I went back to work and I took in a traditional Welsh fruitcake. And that's how I began to develop a relationship with those people in the community that I was working with. They actually never asked me once what I did for a living. It was about how I conducted myself. It was about the way I interacted with them and more importantly, how I treated my family and my community. And what I would say when we do introductions or say we conduct an acknowledgement of country, that really gets to the heart of where I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding in culture about what country means, because it is about the connection that we have between us. It's about family. It is about the land that we're on and the sky above, but the space in between. And really importantly, country is about identity. I'm part of a Rotary Club. At the beginning of every meeting, everybody stands up and we give thanks to Rotary, and for food, for health, for faith, the spirit to serve, we give thanks. And then we say, for everyone that came before us, and made this country what it is, Australia, and we give a toast to Australia. And I always think like that's actually like, do you know what we're doing here? We're acknowledging country, because country isn't the geographical boundaries of the place that we live. It is about the people. If I ask you, think about what matters most to you in this world, and you might think about your family. You might have a favourite fishing spot. You might have some other relationships even within this organisation that you really care about. You might have, a place that you grew up. That connection is much closer to what country is than just thinking about the geographical boundaries. And so in that way, when we think about ourselves and our connection and what an introduction is, it's really about who we are and how we hold place in our hearts.
So in that spirit, who are you, Kurt?
All right, so I'm a Palawa man from Lutruwita, the traditional place name of where my family is from in Tasmania. Lutruwita is Tasmania. It's called Pinmatic. It's Rocky Cape. Through my mother's lineage and the Deverell side, Deverell family up on the northwest coast. On the other side, I have English convict ancestors. They were sentenced to transportation in the 1830s for stealing some money from Birmingham in England. On the other side, on my father's side, I have Scottish and German ancestry. Immigrants in the 1950s. Both my grandmother came from Scotland and my grandfather emigrated from Germany after the Second World War, after they were run off their farm by Russians. My family were Nazis. My great-grandfather was a captain of a POW camp. And obviously, at the end of the war, he remained behind when the United States and Russia took over Germany. And my grandfather, who was only a little boy at the time, moved out here with his mother to create a new life in Australia. My parents, one is a blue-collar worker, my dad. He grew up in the western suburbs of Melbourne, just a rouseabout character. And my mother, who grew up in Tasmania, is now retired. She just moved back to Tasmania last week. And she was the CEO of the Alice Spring and Launceston's Women's Shelter, a fierce feminist and advocate for women's rights. In many ways, I am my mother's son in that space, and I guess that's how I entered into the role that I'm in now after a long career as a bouncer previously. They instilled in me values that have stuck with me. My dad is a very hard worker. He's 66 years old. He gets up and trains in the gym for 2 hours before a 12-hour workday. So he has his work, but who he is someone who is relentlessly disciplined and incredibly hardworking and cares a lot about his family. And my mother is someone who has a deep sense of justice for the world around them. However, everybody's interpretation of what that looks like varies, but they've certainly, I think, helped sculpt me into the person that I am and pursue the kinds of things that I do in life.
So to transition then to, I suppose, the Western side of the introduction, how do you bring all of those parts to yourself, to your job at QPAC? So, transitioning all of that knowledge of history and society and family, how does that turn up in your work?
Sure. Well, I suppose I should provide a little bit of the Western background of my career so that it isn't foreign to people, and I can talk about how I ended up in this role as the Director of First Nations Strategy. Directors of First Nations Strategy exist in a few organisations around the country now, and heads of First Nations Strategy, certainly a decade ago, they weren't a job that existed. It is something that people have recognised, and I wrote a note in the intro to the show. It said, there's a customer demand for sustainability. And I heard that come through my headset, and I thought that's a really good point. I'll write that down because it really does get to the heart of why organisations are starting to have First Nations perspectives in their organisations, because it's critical to sustainability. But obviously it's not what I've always done. when I was 19 years old, I began my career as a bouncer. I needed a job. Back then, I didn't even have a security license, which was illegal at the time. But, hopefully no one gets me in trouble for something that happened 20 years ago. And for a few weeks, I just went out as an observer, actually, and watched guys do the job of crowd controller in a number of licensed venues. I'm a big fella, and so some people I knew said, you should gravitate towards that kind of job. And so I did that for several years before starting my own company when I was 26, and actually decided to make a career out of the security industry. And in the same month, in September 2012, I enrolled in university for a Bachelor of Arts majoring in security, terrorism and counterterrorism, and started my own security company. So I completed a Diploma of Security and Risk Management first, and then I completed my bachelor's degree in security. I went on to do a master's degree in security. I also have a graduate diploma of strategic leadership, a graduate diploma of management, and a graduate certificate of finance. And I'm currently studying an MBA and a Master of International Business as well. Which
You like to be busy?
Still makes me the least qualified person in my household. My partner's a PhD candidate. So it's not that it's a contest at home, even though it a little bit is. But I do like to be very busy. And it was when I was studying security that I really reframed the way that I thought about human behaviour. I think that the criminological aspects of the study that I did were far more prescriptive about the things I was seeing in the world and the end results of behaviour that resulted in me having to respond to security issues than anything I'd ever done in the past or thought about. And it made me think that, in fact, the way that we deal with these issues, and look, a lot of it was just drunks in pubs, but there's a lot of underlying things that lead to someone throwing a punch in a pub. And it made me think about it from, like, what happened to this guy when he was 5 years old that resulted in this? What kind of things did he learn growing up? What kind of environment did he have? Who were influencing him? What kind of positive role models did they have that resulted in this behaviour 20 years later? And you go into what security actually means, and it's things like making sure your community is safe, making sure you have access to healthcare, making sure you have access to economic mobility, making sure your personal safety walking down the street is something that you're comfortable with, making sure that the ecological space that you live in is able to sustain you. That's what security means. It's not about punitive measures, although there is an element where that's important. It in fact pales in comparison to all of the other things I mentioned, which come under the banner of human security. And so as I was going down this path, I got a job as a security manager on site at Esrock Resort. If anyone who's listening has ever been out to Uluru, there's 760 hotel rooms out there. There are another 1,000 accommodation blocks for people that live out there. And at any given time, there's 1,500 staff members and up to 6,000 guests. And then there are the remote communities around. So I got the job as the security manager out there. And so I'm working as the security manager and I'm learning at uni at the same time. So they're happening concurrently. And I started to try things, okay? Instead of going, we need more guards, we need more target hardening, we need to think about crime and crime prevention through environmental design. I thought, why don't I just take the security guards to meet some of these young people that, perhaps come into town and run a little bit of a muck? Why don't we just go and make friends with them? Let's just build this relationship. And that's kind of where things began for me. What if within the community, the security guards who only rock up necessarily when bad things happen and that makes the security guards form a view about this individual, why don't I introduce them well before that? So when we would run community events, I would make the security team staff the barbecue. I wanted to enhance their perspective of the people that they were dealing with, on a human front. And so I really thought deeply about what the best way that we could approach security, from that perspective was. And I read a lot about community policing, and I read a lot about criminological theory, and eventually I went to one of the bosses and I said, look, I'd like a little more responsibility at the resort. And they they allowed me to take over the social emotional wellbeing team of all the teams out there. And some people saw it as a funny thing where I became a general manager and I'm looking after security and then social emotional wellbeing. So I had a team of counsellors reporting to me and community activities coordinators. And there's actually a lot of synergy between those two from the beginning end with the wellbeing side of things, and the counsellors that are able to kind of see and are exposed to behaviours that may occur, and relaying that to the security team about where they're able to prevent and respond appropriately. So that's kind of how it began. And then I mentioned the Community Safety Night Patrol program. I decided to go out to that myself. I thought, what is the very best way that I can prevent, an at-risk youth from coming in here and doing something that might get them in trouble? And it's like, actually, it is as easy as just going to kick the footy with them. And so that's how I kind of transitioned into these First Nations roles. I did a good job of that. And then they gave me responsibility for the National Indigenous Training Academy at Uluru and the Mossman Gorge Cultural Centre, which is also an incredible place if you ever get the opportunity to head up there. And then responsibility for the Indigenous engagement programs as well, which are remote area job programs. And they taught me a lot about, how we provide flexible employment models for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that can be sensitive to their cultural needs, and also teach us as organisations how we can, I suppose I'll stop there, because it's the framing that's always used is how do we get people job ready, when in fact it's like, how do we get our organisation ready? How do we get our organisation ready to integrate culture? What can we take from culture that actually enhances our organisation? And so I guess that's the story of my career that's resulted in me now working in the performing arts. I, never been part of the arts before. Tourism was my last role, and prior to that, I was a doorman.
So, flashing forward to now then,
yes,
you're living in a city, so you've moved from a much more remote context to one that's increasingly built up in Brisbane, and you're working in a government-owned construct. There's layers of bureaucracy that's involved with that. Those amazing insights that you shared then about this broader look at what security and safety is in the context of a venue. How do you now bring that forward into the context you're operating in today?
Sure. So I mean, we've talked about it offline a little bit, but there are a number of things that I think Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture really can bring to these traditional Western systems that provide a lot of strength. And the first thing that comes to mind is what community is. A lot of the remote communities still are 100, 200 people. And if you think about what our brains have been wired for throughout human history until, and it's been changed rapidly recently as we all live in these urbanised areas, is that we lived in villages with only 150 or 200 people. And in Western society, you now have these nuclear families, 4 or 5 people, actually, and they're shrinking, that live separately to the community around them and are required to sustain themselves. And so one of the beautiful things, and every organisation, and I'm sure the people listening to this will go, we operate in silos. Everyone operates in silos. The beauty of my role is that I have to work across every piece of the organisation, and reconciliation and First Nations is one of the, even in our organisation, the only roles that really truly must integrate with everyone. And that gives me this beautiful perspective of all of the roles that exist. And I think that First Nations people kind of have this, this intuitive way of bringing people together. They understand their role as stewards and, what it means to connect. And so I think from my own perspective, the kind of value that I'm able to bring is that I develop relationships with everyone. Now they've got passing relationships, but the marketing unit may not have objectives they need to set or work with on the production services unit that much. Marketing's far more likely to work with one team than another, like curatorial, where they create the shows and then they market the shows. And I have the ability that, we have a reconciliation action plan. You don't necessarily need one, but they are a great place to start and a great resource to work across teams and really go, reconciliation isn't something that is, an outward-facing part of our business in the sense that you don't put a show on of reconciliation. It is something that everybody can work together on because the relationship between government, as you mentioned earlier, where we work for, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been brutal in the past, and we're still working on rebuilding trust, and that does require efforts from everyone. And I found in my time working is that in these roles, there's a lot of good intent, but there is a lot of trepidation about how they might be treated if there's a misstep, if you try to engage with the community and you do it the wrong way. And I've definitely done it the wrong way in the past myself. I'm always learning that you might be too afraid to do it again. And so I suppose I like to see my role as a guide and use, those kinds of introductions rather than going, what do we do? It is about who we are and bringing that back to the work that we do and how we interact with each other in an organisation and community.
And the idea that the relationship is the project. So
Exactly.
that's not a thing I just made up. That's actually a book that someone's written.
Oh, yeah, right. But it is.
But certainly, the idea in Western culture that we're always working towards an outcome and the relationship is in service of that.
Yes.
To me seems inverted, where when we're working on things together in this context, it's always to strengthen the relationships and the coherence of the community. One of the things that we talked about offline as well, which I think is worth calling out for listeners as well, to contextualise this, because 99% of people listening to this podcast are not going to be Indigenous, but are also descended from traditional cultures. And it's a thing that's often missed in the dialogue around First Nations culture in Australia, in the performing arts, in venues generally, is that there is somehow this dichotomy of Aboriginal people who've been on this land for 80,000 years plus, and then somehow this group of white or other immigrant people who've only existed for a maximum of, 260 years, when in reality, when you go back into, the origins of Anglo-Saxon culture, cultures all around the world, these same principles around community and connection to land are fundamental to those as well. And the thing that inspires me about this conversation is that this is a pathway back into us inheriting our birthright, regardless of what your background is. But that's not an angle that we typically approach this conversation from.
And I think venues have this really privileged position of bringing people together unlike anyone else can. I mean, you have this opportunity. I mean, we're recording this near Suncorp, and you think, how often can you get 40,000 people together? Like, I couldn't. And when you have that, you have this, this opportunity to grasp of really going, okay, I've got them here, as a venue, how do we make them feel a sense of place? And it's really interesting you mentioned about the Anglo-Saxon roots, and we've talked about that in the past, because just yesterday I was talking to my partner, and I'm heading to Tasmania next week to see my mum, and I say, I always feel different. Now, I'm an atheist. Like, I'm not necessarily a particularly spiritual person, but when I go back to Tasmania, I do feel different. And she said the same thing about Wales. So she's gone to visit her grandmother in the valleys on a number of occasions. She didn't grow up there. She grew up in New Zealand and Australia. She's been there a handful of times. We're talking in the weeks throughout her life, maybe a dozen weeks throughout her entire lifetime. And when she goes there, she feels different. That's where she feels a sense of place. And she's done one of those DNA tests. Not surprising to me, that's where she's from. And when I say that's where she's from, we're talking about a deeper meaning than just where you're born. A sense of belonging does come from far deeper than the place you grow up. It is in your DNA. Indigenous heritage is in my DNA, but I feel the same way when I was in Scotland, and I know that my grandmother came from Glasgow and that's where our family's from. I felt like that there. And so everybody has an opportunity to connect with place in that regard, and I think we do lose that a little bit in Western society. But what is exciting about a discussion like this, and whilst we might never be able to replicate it perfectly, venues do have a unique position to go, you're intentionally coming to this place to feel something, whether it's sport, music, theatre, it is enriching your life in some way, what you're watching, and it can be more than just what you're looking at. It can be the place that you go to as well.
And within that as well then is the culture of working within a venue. So it's not just what the venue can offer an audience, but then how we try to replicate and leverage the power of that in the community of people that are working in this industry. And for me in my role running the VMA, that's the thing that excites me about it, is that for a living we create experiences for people, but this industry as a community and as a metaphorical place of sorts that people can come back to for, in modern parlance, we call it the network.
Yeah.
But really it's about, connecting back to the source of the wisdom and knowledge of the elders that have been there before. And these kinds of associations play a kind of pseudo role in a sense that they're trying to replicate something that we've lost, so that business isn't just about competition. It's also about, how we're working together to create something that we have an aligned purpose
and shared
around.
experience. As a venue managers association, I've never run a venue. I've worked in them now, but where do you go to speak to someone who understands what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis? Talking about working in these places, you do spend 40 hours a week in these incredible venues, and you're mostly gearing everything you're doing to making sure someone else has a good time. But it's incredibly important that you connect with the place that you're at. And I think that's something, again, that First Nations culture can really offer venue management. I think it's something, because it's so deeply ingrained in what First Nations culture does and who they are, there's a lot to be taken away, even in terms of venue design and the way that, I'll give you an example. So this isn't necessarily a venue, it's a prison that I'm aware of. But when you design a prison and allow the inmates to connect with country, it has high visibility, it's connected to waterways if they are Indigenous to a particular location, and it allows them to connect with their ancestral spirit, you have much lower, it's not talking out my ass, I studied criminology, you have much lower rates of recidivism because people are now able to connect with country. And that's an extreme example, but if you take people who work in venues and you provide them with opportunities to connect genuinely with the place that they work so that they feel a deep sense of value and purpose and sustainability, you're going to get better outcomes because that's going to flow on to the people that you're taking care of, rather than just showing up for a job. And maybe they have great technical expertise in the area that they're doing, but, they're working in, but enthusiasm and belonging are really what get people to participate in any activity.
Can you talk a little bit more about specifics now in terms of things about First Nations community and culture that we can practically draw into. You've touched on a few examples, but maybe if you've got a few more in terms of the way we can enhance the experience both for the audience and for people working within the venues.
Yeah, and this is something that I do get really passionate about because I do work at the theatre, and the first thing that comes to mind is storytelling. Storytelling is not the unique domain of the theatre or the cinema. Storytelling can be done anywhere. It is the narrative that drives us. I mean, when we think we're in the middle of a federal election campaign, you could ask people what the policies that the politicians are going to put forward, but the narrative and the story that they tell is far more important. And as venues, you take the, people that work in a venue and go, well, what do you do? Well, I work in lighting. It's like, well, you do so much more than that. I mean, you provide athletes with the opportunity to achieve their dream. You provide a place for people to escape. You provide, an opportunity, like in the theatre, for me and my culture to bring stories to life that have never been told before, that are so essential to our being and the truth-telling process, that it allows us to heal. And so you go, I do lighting, I do sound design. It's like, actually, what you do is so much deeper and so embedded and ingrained in who we are as human beings, that, I think that's the sort of thing that will get you out of bed at night. Get you out of bed in the morning. Then there are other things like I've thought about in venue design and even where I work. It's a brutalist architecture. It's not the most attractive building. It's a big concrete block. And I think about, how we can integrate, we lived on the land as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we connected with it and were sustained by it. And, I think most people would feel like when you go outside and you walk on the grass in bare feet as opposed to shoes, you feel something different. And it's kind of, how do we use the buildings that we have to integrate the natural world around us? How can we make it feel like we're connecting with nature and country in a way that most of us don't on a day-to-day basis? We get in our car, we go home, we go to work. When you go to a venue like this, you go to a venue and watch a sporting match or you watch a theatre performance, what about it makes you feel connected? And it's not just the people, it is the design of the venue. We have got the new performing arts venue, which is hopefully opening next year.
More organic shapes.
More organic shapes, exactly. From our skylights to the way that the bars are designed, to the way that the windows are designed, everything is a more organic shape because it's far more natural for people. And, when we talk about country, the reason I love that kind of design is because, country is alive and it makes you feel like the building is alive and you're alive and you're actually connecting with something that is living, rather than just, a sculpture or a monotonous kind of object that's just there to carry the function of what you want to do. It is part of the experience. So I think that those, kinds of things, and these are also sustainable design practices, right? A lot of the stuff we're doing, is moving to the circular economy, or we're hoping to move to circular economy. Certainly, that's something that I'm passionate about. My partner's an environmental scientist, so I hear about it at home all the time. Is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had to sustain the land that they were on. One, because they care about it. Two, because it's how you survived. If you didn't practice that, then your group of people, well, they perished. And so if we think about those principles in the way that we design buildings and venues, we're going to get outcomes that are far more ingrained in us as human beings than what we've been told to do. This kind of consumption of, of things and the way that the capitalist system, is set up about consume, that is actually more ingrained with who we are as human beings than the kind of environment that we've created around us, at least in my opinion.
But that strikes me as well as pivotal to addressing mental health crisis as well. And even from a sort of regulatory perspective, psychosocial well-being in the workplace is, a legislated obligation of venues, and that if the venue design can do something to connect people working in those venues to nature and community and to meaning and purpose more, surely that's going to have a positive impact on their mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. The legislation has changed a couple of years ago. We have a positive duty towards people's mental health, and often that burden does get passed on to, and rightfully so, about the way that management conducts itself and how we interact with our team members. But the environment that we work in is just as important. Yesterday at work, the blinds wouldn't go up. They're electronic blinds, made the room dark, made me feel sad. That's the truth. It fundamentally changed the way that my day unfolded because there was a malfunctioning blind. And if we're able to design venues that do bring people, a sense of calm, a sense of even history, you are able to create a workplace that is going to get better mental health outcomes. You're going to get, better attrition rates, far less staff turnover, people advocating for the place that you work. Like, the flow-on effects are quite substantial, and will also lead to more profitable venues, which, let's not forget, that is an essential part of what many of your listeners require, is running venues profitably. And I think that does get to some of the harder discussion, is like, we have the way that we do things, but there is the way that things should be done. And I think what we've talked about is a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, culture and examples can be integrated to actually make your business more profitable.
I'm forever fascinated with the link, potential or real, between wisdom and profitability.
Yes.
So the idea that, it's increasingly taught in business schools that we need wise leaders. What that means in practice outside of traditional cultures is quite contentious and quite poorly defined. I'm just interested for you to expand a little bit on the idea of that relationship between wisdom and profitability. Like, what are and maybe a way of framing it is, what are the unwise things that are currently at the centre of the way we do business, and sometimes in venues as well, that unknowingly are impacting our profitability?
Oh, that's a big question, Joel. It's a big question.
I only ask big questions.
Yeah, it's but it's a really important question as well. And I suppose I'll start by let's start talking about some of the wise things that people can do, and it does go kind of back to our previous question, about venue, the way a venue is designed, and what sustainability is. I mean, an example again, the new performing arts venue. We talked about traditional shapes, but we're also using sustainable materials to build it. And I think actually that has a wise and unwise practice, right? Like, we're using oak or red cedar. I'm not the architect. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's a sustainable wood all through the new theatre, because its life cycle is long. It's more easily replenished. It isn't going to cost nearly as much in the long term as some of these very easy to produce, very fast to get up materials that we use. And so I would actually say that is one of the things where, engaging with what we have around us rather than trying to, use non-sustainable materials that might get things up faster but last for less time. And, asbestos, those sort of things are great examples of our follies of the past, where, we can really integrate those textures, forms and feelings into a sense of place. In terms of wisdom, I use this example all the time, and I love to talk about how we integrate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture into Western society. And one of the big things for me is the concept of eldership, and even who advises your venues. As an example, you've got venues all across Australia and New Zealand that are going to have different Indigenous contexts. In Australia there are far less homogenous than it is in New Zealand, but in each location you're going to have traditional custodians that are going to be able to provide you with advice. In Western society, when you retire, that's it. You reach 67, thank you very much, here's your pension or you access your super, and no one really cares too much about what occurs for the remainder of your life. And there's a lot of research that shows us that in Western society, older people go into depression, they get high levels of anxiety. If they do have things like cognitive decline, it accelerates once they retire because they're less active, they're less valued. And I have some personal examples, in that space as well. In Indigenous culture, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, where it's not Aboriginal culture where it's not a chieftain system and you have elders rather than an elder or a chief, that knowledge is valued until that person dies. We recently at the Queensland Performing Arts Centre had John Kotsis, who was our chief executive for 15 years. He worked at the Queensland Performing Arts Centre for 35 years. And I did the opening acknowledgement at his farewell event.
I was there.
Yeah, you were there. Yeah, right. And I said, if I think about the concept of eldership, I can think of few people more worthy than John Kotsis. And the reason being is that although John's retired now, his knowledge didn't go anywhere. Why wouldn't you want to tap into that, for as long as he wants to, of course, and why wouldn't you want to find other people like him that perhaps are not as busy as you and I are, like he's got older kids, he perhaps has more time, to provide that 35 years of experience to you. And I think, we often stack boards and executive positions with people who are super ambitious, which is great. They could be highly qualified, like I have, I have a number of qualifications, but doesn't necessarily mean that I'm particularly wise. That actually doesn't translate to that at all. I require people who have experience and who have knowledge and who have time to contribute to my growth. At QPAC, we have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory group, 5 very senior people who I'm able to bounce ideas off. I'm definitely not the font of all knowledge, far from it. In fact, and for your listeners who do listen to this podcast, like I'm a 6'3" white-skinned guy, and the world treats me like that. My experiences are partly formed by how the world has treated me, and I don't ever want to hide away from that. I've never suffered a day of racism in my life. And so when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues, I actually require eldership and knowledge to enhance the work that I'm able to do. And so I think there's a lot that can be gained, particularly, in the venue space, and given how broad your base is as an organisation and the amount of people that they're able to tap on the shoulder that perhaps do have time, maybe they're a little bit older, that's actually where the value is, because, there's also lots of research that whilst our brains and our IQs slow down as we get older, the amount of knowledge we retain is still able to increase. And whilst that sits in our brain, maybe we don't process it as quickly. It's there and it's so, so valuable. And I think that that's really something that Western society, but Western organisations should really harness, is to go, who was in Joel's seat 30 years ago? The history can teach us. Yes, there are new technologies and there are new ways of doing things, but, we shouldn't be discarding that knowledge of the past.
I mean, that as a concept applies not just to retired people, but also when people leave jobs or, move to the next venue. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, an organisation that I used to run successively has gone through hard times.
Yeah.
But those hard times were mimicking other hard times pretty much to the letter that had been solved and survived through by myself and a previous board.
Yeah.
And certainly the offer has always been there to talk about that and, offer insights into the past. But it's never been taken up, and that organisation just keeps suffering through the same dynamic. I think as well, this question of wisdom in leadership is also hugely applicable to the way the cultures within organisations and venues develop, where, you don't have to be the old wise leader, but you need to at least have enough wisdom to know that it's not all about you. And wise leadership is actually pretty thin on the ground, I think, and there's more that I would love this association to do in the long term to foster that. I think we, for many good reasons, are becoming more focused on questions like technology and, very future-oriented issues. Equally, our success is going to be determined by how well we can reach into the past and grab those things that are really valuable that have been forgotten. And some of that is going to be through our system of eldership within this association, which actually has been its foundation from the beginning. And many of the key contributors to this organisation have been involved for like 30 years and are very, very committed to playing that role. I'm not sure they consciously know that they're kind of imitating something from the deep past, but they're certainly intuitively playing that role. But equally, it's conversations like these and reaching into spaces beyond what we might consider the traditional construct of the venue management industry in Australia, because I think that question of kind of pluralism and diversity and being able to tap into lots of different ways of thinking is going to be incredibly important to the future of the industry.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And if I think about it, not just through a First Nations lens, I have my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory group, and if you want to integrate First Nations perspectives into your venues, you could get an elder in residence. You can have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory committee as long as you're genuinely committed to it. You can have an advisory group. You may have traditional custodians that that you pay sitting fees to come into, and act like consultants. There are a number of ways to get Indigenous voices into your venues. But similarly, there's going to be a whole range of stuff that I have no idea about sitting here when it comes to venue management that everybody listening to this does. It is about thinking, outside of those traditional Western methods to access that knowledge. And hearing you talk about technology, something that I've talked about with some of my friends, the skills of the future that have the highest value will be relational, because they will be the commodity that is least accessible because everybody uses technology. So that ability to build relationships, to connect with each other, to share stories, to be a storyteller is actually a commodity that's going to be of great value. I don't think there's anybody more suited for those roles than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but if you're able to effectively connect that, the venues that you have, they become more than just spaces for performances or for sport or for music or for speeches. They become places for cultural exchange, healing and shared belonging.
We're almost out of time. I was just about to ask you about the future of the industry, but you've really kind of like nailed that in one go. I mean, I certainly agree that particularly with AI driving the price of content to zero very, very quickly, it's going to be moments of connectedness that will be the things that retain value. I mean, you've just said that yourself, but certainly like we're living through the beginning of that now, and that puts venues in an incredibly vital position in terms of being at the centre of the way the economy is going to transform, because the building of widgets and products is going to be something that is going to be still have a human hand in, certainly from the perspective of the imagination's key role in driving them, but from a production perspective, you know, computers and robots are going to be much more involved in automating those kind of things. Do you see what's the pathway for the average person working in this industry to get exposure to community? So you've talked a bit about, well, let's bring elders into a venue, and that's got its place and a particular function. But, you know, certainly people close to me who've become genuinely knowledgeable about Aboriginal culture understand that there's an immersion that's required for that to be a real and not a token thing. What can people who are in venues do out in the world to gain more of that knowledge?
Well, something that I learned recently at the Queensland Tourism Awards is that 85% of international tourists would like to partake in a cultural tourism experience. That's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. The cultural tourism sector is booming locally where we are here in Brisbane, but all over the country. And so there are opportunities to engage with culture at a deep level that exist beyond going to a gallery and looking at Indigenous art, which certainly has its place, but culture is so much more than dot paintings. You know, what I would encourage people to do is to take the opportunity to participate. As an example, our organisation now has just authorised and begun last month cultural tours of our local area where we are on the South Bank area at Brisbane. Cultural tours for every single full-time staff member that provide us the opportunity to learn a little bit about the contextual history, good and bad, and also the ancient history of that area from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective to understand where you're standing. And also understand one thing I would say to people is, you know, as I mentioned before, you know, 1,000 years from now, your stories will be integrated into the land that you're on. So think about the way that you interact with things from that perspective. It certainly changes the way that you do things. I would highly encourage people, if they are travelling, and this is a bit of a bigger one, you know, I was on a flight the other day. I read in the Qantas magazine about cultural tours that are taking place on the northeast coast of Tasmania. You have the Mossman Gorge Cultural Centre in far north Queensland, where I used to work, which is an incredible Aboriginal-owned organisation and employs 70% Indigenous people, many of them from the local community. Ezrock Resort, if you head out there, and Voyages Indigenous Tourism Australia, they have incredible opportunities to engage with the culture. And if you go out into the national park, you know, the local Angangu people, they love to share their culture. There are opportunities all over the country to engage with Indigenous cultural immersion experiences through tourism. And so, you know, it's not more than a Google search away.
And while we're encouraging people to have experiences, VMA Congress is coming up in June at the ICC Convention Centre. I'm thrilled that you will be there in conversation with Jolene Elliott from New Zealand. Just before we go, do you want to give us a bit of a taste of that conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I had the absolute fortune of already having one discussion with Jolene, and it will be conducted kind of like this. There'll be a little bit of questions. There'll be a lot of discussion and kind of open conversation around, you know, what does it mean to be First Nations people that work in this space, and what is the beauty of it is, and Jolene and I had it when we first met, is you're going to see a real cultural exchange between Maori, First Nations Australian and Western culture, you know, and I think that there's a lot that we're going to be able to learn from each other in, I think we'll have 45 minutes, right, Joel? And hopefully we'll get across a lot of stuff, but I would encourage everybody to come. Jolene is incredible. It was a real privilege to talk to her, and her story is powerful too.
Mate, thank you so much for joining us today. We could talk for hours on this, and as you said, 45 minutes isn't going to be long enough at Congress, but I think the important thing is that we are having a continuous dialogue about the value of this knowledge and the importance of First Nation culture and people within our venue management industry. So thanks for joining me today.
It was absolutely my pleasure, Joel. Thanks for having me.